By the time the county water assessor drove out to the Tremaine property in the last week of July, the pasture on the south side of the Cedar Break was the greenest thing in a 30-mile radius, and that was not an exaggeration anyone in Fayette County was making anymore. They had made it in May as an exaggeration, the kind you use to dismiss something without engaging with it directly. By July, it was a description. The assessor, a man named Curtis Adele who had worked the hill country for 16 years and who had seen a good many things that did not match his maps, parked his truck at the gate and stood with one boot on the running board and looked at the south pasture for a while before he went in. The cattle were grazing in the particular unhurried way of animals that have not been thinking about water. The grass under their feet was deep enough to bend. It was 94 degrees and had been something close to that for 6 weeks, and the Medina River gauge at Castroville was at its second lowest recorded level, and 3 neighboring ranches had already trucked in supplemental water at a cost that was changing the arithmetic of their operations in ways that some of them would not recover from. Curtis Adele had been to those ranches. He had seen what 94 degrees did to unwatered ground. He looked at the Tremaine South pasture, and he took out his notebook and he wrote something in it, and then he looked again, because sometimes a thing needs to be looked at twice before you trust what you wrote. The cedar break at the pasture's far edge was dark and dense against the white sky, and somewhere behind it, the river the Tremaine family had found by following their cows ran clear over its limestone bed, the same as it had run for 10,000 years, which was before any map had thought to look for it, and before any family had thought to follow what the cattle already knew. A thing is where it is, Clara Tremaine had said to her father-in-law the morning they found it, and it was there before we needed it. That spring, 14 months before, she had been new enough to the property that she still called it the property. The hill country between Kerrville and Uvalde is limestone country in the specific and uncompromising way of places where the rock is not below the surface but is the surface. A pale gray karst landscape of cedar and live oak and thin caliche soil over the Edwards Aquifer, beautiful in the particular way of places that do not make any concession to your comfort or your plans. Water in the hill country is a conversation between the sky and the stone that has been going on a long time without consulting the people in between, and the terms of it are not negotiable. Rain falls and either runs off the impermeable surface to the creek beds or disappears into the fractures and fissures of the limestone to join the aquifer below. And the creeks and rivers that do run year-round do so because they are fed by springs emerging from that aquifer at points where the geology puts the water table at the surface, which is not everywhere, and is not always where it is convenient for a ranch operation. The conventional management of water in Fayette County's hill country sections was a system of stock tanks, earthen impoundments built at the low points of surface drainage to capture whatever the sky sent, supplemented in dry years by pumping from on-site wells that drew from the aquifer at depths and rates that the aquifer tolerated well in wet years, and less well in the kind of extended dry that had been visiting the region with increasing regularity. The man who understood this system better than anyone in the county, who had helped design or repair or assess more stock tanks and more wells than he could accurately count, was the county agricultural agent, a man named Harmon Bledsoe, who had held that position for 23 years and who had the specific authority of someone who has been right about the fundamentals for long, enough that the fundamentals have become, in the county's mind, his personal property. The Tremaine family had bought the south section, 420 acres of hill country cedar and thin pasture, and 2 aging stock tanks the previous February, which was late enough in the negotiation of the purchase that they had not seen the property in a wet season, and early enough in their ranching experience that they had not known to ask the right questions about what a dry summer would cost them. Jonas Tremaine had grown up on the Texas coast and had worked offshore before the industry contracted, and had come to ranching by the specific route of wanting a different life and having a father-in-law who had ranched goats in the hill country, and who had told him, with the careful honesty of a man who loves his daughter and does not want to lie to the man she married, that hill country ranching was not a simple business, and that water was the variable that made everything else easy or hard. That father-in-law was a man named Dolph Kreider, 70 years old, who had sold his own place 8 years earlier when his knees would no longer negotiate the terrain, and who had come to live at the edge of the Tremaine operation, not quite as a hired hand and not quite as a guest and not quite as a manager, but as the thing that a person becomes when they know too much about a subject to be uninvolved. Clara Tremaine had grown up watching her father read the land the way other people read weather forecasts, looking at the grass and the soil and the movement of the animals, and drawing conclusions that he would not always explain because some of what he knew was not yet language. She had some of that in her, and she had a degree in range science from Texas A&M that had given it a framework. And the combination of those two things was what made her dangerous in the way that people who see accurately are always somewhat dangerous to the arrangements that depend on nobody looking too closely. The cows started pushing through the cedar break in April. The Tremaines ran 63 Angus cross cattle on the 420 acres, a stocking rate that Harmon Bledsoe had already told them was optimistic for the rainfall projections, and the cattle had access to the upper pasture and the lower draw, and the cedar break was supposed to be a windbreak and a boundary, not a destination. Jonas found the first break in the brush on a Tuesday morning in the second week of April. 3 cedar trees pushed sideways, and the ground between them worked into a path about 18 inches wide, narrow enough that he had assumed deer and had not followed it. He mended the fence and forgot about it. The cattle were through a second time by Thursday. He mended it again on Friday and was back at the same section by the following Monday with a different set of conclusions forming. Clara walked the fence with him that morning and looked at the break and looked at the ground and looked at the direction the path ran into the break, which was not toward the neighboring property and was not toward the county road and was into the interior of a cedar thicket that nobody on the operation had penetrated because cedar breaks in the hill country are not places you go without a reason, being dense and thorny and full of the specific unpleasantness of a plant community that has evolved to resist interference. She said she wanted to follow it. Jonas said the cedar would tear them up. Clara said she would get the leather gloves. The path through the cedar was longer than the width of the break suggested it should be, which was the first indication that the break was concealing something that had a longer dimension than its visible edge implied. It wound in the way that animal paths wind through dense vegetation, following the easiest line through obstacles rather than the shortest line, between points, and the cedar closed over it in a way that made it feel darker and quieter than the open pasture behind them, and the ground underfoot changed from the pale caliche and exposed rock of the pasture to a darker, damper soil that held the prints of hooves clearly enough to show that more than a few animals had come this way more than a few times. They went perhaps 200 yards into the break before the cedar thinned abruptly, and they came out onto a narrow band of sycamores and willows, and the specific green that willows produce when they have permanent water at their roots, and behind the willows they found the river. It was not large. It was perhaps 8 feet across and running at about knee depth over a pale limestone bed, clear enough to count the gravel, and moving with the purposeful ease of water that has somewhere to go and has been going there for a long time. Clara stood at the edge and looked at it. Jonas stood next to her. Neither of them said anything that would be worth repeating, because what there was to say about finding a running river in the middle of a drought on a property that a county agent had told you would need supplemental water trucking within 6 weeks was mostly not language. Clara put her hand in the river and felt the temperature of it, which was cold in the specific way of spring-fed water that has come up from the aquifer, constant in temperature the way the ground is constant, 58 degrees summer and winter. That temperature meant it was not a surface run that would disappear when the rain stopped. It meant it was coming from below. She looked upstream to find the source and walked the bank for 200 meters until she found the spring where the water emerged from the base of a limestone exposure, welling up clear and quiet, and at a rate that she estimated by counting seconds against the movement of a leaf, and wrote in the small notebook she carried in her back pocket, and calculated that evening at the kitchen table with Jonas and Dolph at a figure of approximately 240 gallons per minute, which at that rate, sustained over a dry summer, was a number that changed the arithmetic of the whole operation. Dolph said very little when they told him. He asked 2 questions, one about the temperature and one about whether the spring showed signs of seasonal variation in the bank vegetation above the waterline. Clara told him the temperature and described the bank vegetation, and Dolph looked at his coffee cup and said that his own grandfather had talked about springs on properties in the hill country that the county surveys hadn't found, because nobody had looked for them in the right places, and that the county surveys hadn't looked for them, because the cistern and tank system had been the established solution for long enough that looking harder hadn't seemed necessary. He said this without emphasis or accusation, in the way that an old man states a fact that he has had enough years to stop being angry about. Clara asked what he meant by the right places, and Dolph said that the cattle always knew that cattle on limestone country found water by smell and by the particular feel of the ground changing under their feet, and that if you wanted to know whether a property had hidden water, you watched where the cattle pushed when you weren't directing them. He said he had told his own neighbors this 3 times over 40 years, and none of them had thought it worth acting on. He did not say this with bitterness. He said it with the equanimity of a man who has made his peace with the gap between what he knows and what people are willing to hear, which is a peace that takes time to make and that, once made, holds. The work of the following 6 weeks was unglamorous in the specific way of work that solves a problem nobody believed existed. Jonas cleared a corridor through the cedar brake wide enough for the cattle to pass without pushing, cutting the cedar back with a chainsaw and a brush hog borrowed from the neighboring property, and burning the slash in piles that were visible from the county road and that generated, among the county road's users, a set of questions that were answered with variations of burning brush, which was true and was not the whole truth, and was all Jonas offered. Clara mapped the river's course through the break, walking its bank with a compass and a measuring tape and the county topo map, and found that it ran for just over half a mile on the Tremaine property before entering the neighboring ranch to the east, which meant the half-mile and the spring that fed it were wholly within their fence lines, which was the legal fact she needed before she thought about anything else. She measured the spring output on 3 separate mornings at 6 a.m. and got readings of 230, 245, and 250 gallons per minute, a consistency that told her the flow was not responding to the surface conditions and was not going to. She measured the river's depth at 3 points and found it running 18 inches at its shallowest. She noted the pool that had formed at the base of the largest sycamore, 6 feet deep and 12 across, where the cattle had already found their way to drink, and where, on her third visit, she found the tracks of deer and turkey in one set she could not identify, and that Dolph, when she described the print, said was mountain lion, which meant the pool had been known to the country's animals long before it was known to anyone who owned the country. She wrote all of this in the notebook and transferred it to a larger notebook on the kitchen table, and then made a clean copy in the account book beside the water cost projections Harmon Bledsoe had given them in March, which had assumed the worst, and which the spring did not change so much as replace with a different set of assumptions entirely. By May, the cattle had established their own schedule with the river, moving to it in the late morning when the pasture temperature climbed, and returning to the shade of the cedar brake's edge in the afternoon, and coming back to the river once more in the early evening. They did this without being directed to do it and without any modification of the routine Jonas had established for the upper pasture. The river was simply a thing they had always done and were now doing openly, which was not quite true but was the way it looked. Clara noted in the larger notebook that the cattle's condition in May was ahead of her projected condition curve for the month, a curve she had drawn in February based on the stock tank water availability and the expected forage quality in a dry spring. The river changed both variables simultaneously. The cattle were watered more consistently than the stock tanks could have managed, and the grass, along the river corridor, fed by moisture wicking outward from the bank, was deeper and greener and more nutritious than the upland pasture that was already showing the dry spring's effects. She drew a new condition curve in May, and it ran above the old one for every remaining month of the year, which meant the operation's financial projections, which had been concerning in February, were not concerning in May, which was a change of considerable magnitude, and which she did not discuss with anyone outside the family because the magnitude of it was not yet demonstrated, and demonstration was the only argument she trusted. Harmon Bledsoe appeared in the second week of June, driving slowly up the ranch road in the way of a man who is looking at something out his window before he has finished deciding what he thinks about it. He had heard about the cedar clearing from Dolph, who had mentioned it at the Kerrville Co-op without mentioning why, which had been enough for Harmon Bledsoe to want to see for himself, because cedar clearing, without an obvious reason, was the kind of thing a county agent noticed. He found Jonas at the upper stock tank, which was at 40% in early June and which was the number Harmon Bledsoe had expected and which was the number that supported his March projections, and he looked at the tank and confirmed the level and then said he had noticed some work in the cedar brake and asked what the plan was. Jonas said they had found a corridor the cattle were using and had opened it up. Harmon Bledsoe said he hoped they weren't planning to depend on whatever was in that brake because cedar brake vegetation in the hill country did not reliably indicate permanent water. It indicated density and shade and the kind of moist microclimate that was pleasant but not structural. Jonas said they appreciated the caution. Harmon Bledsoe drove back down the ranch road and told 2 people in Kerrville that the Tremaine family had opened a cedar brake looking for water and that he expected them to find what everyone found in cedar brakes in a dry year, which was shade. The neighbor to the east was a man named Price Dunbar, who ran 300 acres of hill country under a management system that Harmon Bledsoe considered a model of conventional best practice. Two good stock tanks, a licensed well at 140 feet, a stocking rate calibrated to the rainfall projections, and the kind of careful, debt-conscious conservatism that had kept the Dunbar operation solvent through two previous droughts, while less careful neighbors had sold or consolidated. Price Dunbar drove to the Tremaine fence line in late June when the river entered his property and for the first time in his memory was still running at a rate he could see from the saddle, and he got off his horse and looked at the water and measured the depth with a stick and stood there for a long time. He was not a man who got off his horse to look at a creek in June. He had never had occasion to. The creek that ran through the eastern section of his property was a surface drainage feature that carried water for 4 to 6 weeks after significant rain and was dry the rest of the year, and he had managed around its unreliability the whole time he had owned the land. He looked at the water, and he looked upstream toward the Tremaine property, and he considered what it meant that the creek was running in the third week of a hot June and had not been running the previous June or the June before that, and the only explanation available to him was the one he did not want to use because using it meant that something had changed on the Tremaine property, and changes on neighboring properties that affected your water were not changes you greeted with equanimity. He drove to Harmon Bledsoe's office in Kerrville the following day and said that he had reason to believe the Tremaines were interfering with the natural drainage of a watercourse that crossed his property line, and that he wanted the county to look at it. Harmon Bledsoe had already told two people the Tremaines had not found water. He drove out to the property on a Thursday morning, and he did not find what he had expected to find, which was nothing. What Harmon Bledsoe found on Thursday was a spring with a measured output of 230 gallons per minute running into a corridor of cleared cedar and feeding a half-mile of river that emerged on the Dunbar property as the creek Price Dunbar had been watching. He also found Clara Tremaine at the spring's edge with her notebook, recording her morning measurement, who handed him the measurement log for the previous 7 weeks without being asked. He read through it. The measurements were consistent and specific, and dated and initialed, and were the kind of record that a person keeps when they expect to need it, which told him something about Clara Tremaine that he filed away without comment. He walked the corridor and looked at the cattle and looked at their condition and looked at the grass along the riverbank and did not say anything for a while. He said eventually that the spring was on Tremaine land and was a natural feature, and that there was no basis for a claim of interference with the Dunbar drainage, because you could not interfere with a drainage by making it run more water in the correct direction, which was a legal observation he was not fully qualified to make, but which was also plainly true. He said he would need to report the spring to the County Water Resource Office for registration purposes, and that he expected the water right would be straightforward given the spring's location. He did not say anything about what he had told the two people in Kerrville. He drove to Price Dunbar's place that afternoon and told him that the creek was running because of a natural spring on the Tremaine property and that he did not see grounds for a complaint, and Price Dunbar said he was glad to know it and asked whether the spring was likely to keep running, and Harmon Bledsoe said that based on the 7-week measurement log it appeared to be aquifer-fed and consistent, which meant yes. Price Dunbar came to the Tremaine fence line himself 2 days later, on a Saturday morning, and asked Jonas if he could see the spring. Jonas walked him up through the cedar corridor and showed it to him. Price Dunbar stood at the spring for a long time. He had owned the eastern 300 acres for 19 years and had managed the creek's unreliability as a fixed condition of the operation, adjusting his stocking rate and his tank management and his drought protocols to account for the fact that the creek was not a water source and was not going to be. He looked at the water coming out of the limestone, and he said that he would not have thought to look for it there, and Jonas said they hadn't looked, exactly. Price Dunbar asked what he meant, and Jonas said the cows had been pushing through the break for 3 weeks before they followed them. Price Dunbar looked at the spring and then at the corridor behind them, and then said that he had cattle that pushed fences too, that every rancher in the county had cattle that pushed fences, and that he had never followed one to see why. He said it as a man says a thing that has just cost him something to say, plainly and without self-pity, and Jonas did not press it further because there was nothing in it that needed pressing. The water resource registration was completed in August, and the springs right was recorded in the county surface water registry as a naturally occurring feature with a senior date of establishment preceding all other recorded water rights in the watershed, which was the legal way of saying that the spring had been there longer than anyone's claim on anything, and that its water belonged to the land it came from. Clara filed the registration herself. Driving to the county seat in Kerrville with the measurement log and the topo overlay she had drawn and the statement of discovery she had written in, the clear, specific language of someone who knows that the document will be read by people who did not witness the thing it describes. Curtis Adele at the county water assessor's office processed the registration and asked her 3 questions about the spring's location relative to the Fisher Zone on the county's groundwater map, and Clara answered each one with a specific reference to the topo overlay, and Curtis Adele noted in his processing record that the spring's location was consistent with a documented but previously unsurveyed discharge point on the Edwards Aquifer's western margin, which was a finding of some significance for the county's groundwater modeling, and which he said he would pass to the State Water Board as new data. He also said, without editorializing, that it was an unusual feature to find undocumented on a parcel that had been in agricultural use for 60 years, and Clara said that it had probably been documented before by the cattle that had always known about it, and that the documentation just hadn't been written down in a form anyone had read. Curtis Adele wrote something in his own notebook and said that was a way of putting it. He approved the registration and filed it that afternoon, which was a Thursday, which was the same day that the Medina River gauge at Castroville recorded its second lowest level since records began, and the Tremaine South pasture, 2 counties and a limestone ridge away, was the greenest thing in a 30-mile radius, which it had been since June and which it would be for as long as the aquifer held, which was longer than anyone in Fayette County was currently thinking about. Harmon Bledsoe did not make an announcement at the August County Agricultural meeting, but he did present what he called an update on water resource identification in the Hill Country sections, and he referenced the Tremaine Spring as a case study in the potential for undocumented natural water features on existing agricultural properties, and he said that the County Extension Office was developing a survey protocol to help identify similar features on other properties in the area, a protocol that would include, as one of its assessment tools, observation of livestock fence-pushing behavior as a potential indicator of subsurface water access. He said this in his standard flat, informative delivery without acknowledging that the protocol was the same thing that Dolph Kreider had told his neighbors 3 times over 40 years, and that a 70-year-old retired goat rancher had told his son-in-law on the second week of the spring's discovery. Dolph was not at the August meeting because he did not go to county meetings as a general policy and because the heat was bad for his knees. Clara read the meeting minutes when they were circulated and found the paragraph about the protocol and noted it in the account book under the heading Things That Are True, which was where she put facts that had been confirmed by someone other than herself, which was the only category she trusted fully. By the following spring, 2 neighboring operations had found springs on their properties using a version of the survey approach, one of them by following cattle, and one of them by following a dog that had been digging in the same spot in the cedar for 3 weeks. The Dunbar Eastern section, fed by the Tremaine Springs downstream flow, was carrying more grass than Price Dunbar had budgeted for, and he had adjusted his stocking rate upward by 10%, which was the first upward adjustment he had made in 6 years. He stopped by the Tremaine Gate on a March morning on his way to Kerrville and told Jonas about the adjustment without explaining what had led to it, because Jonas already knew and Price Dunbar was not a man who explained the obvious. He asked how the spring was running, and Jonas said it was running at 245 in the last reading, which was within the range it had held all winter, and Price Dunbar said that was good to know and drove on. Dolph was sitting on the porch when Jonas came back from the gate, and Jonas told him about the conversation, and Dolph said he was glad the Dunbar cattle would have water this year. He did not say anything else about it. He had been glad about the cattle finding the spring since April of the previous year, and he had been glad about it quietly, which was how he had been glad about most things for the last 20 years, and which was a practice that had served him well enough that he saw no reason to change it now. The spring ran on through March and into April, clear over its limestone bed, constant at 58 degrees, feeding the river that the cattle had known about before anyone with a deed to the land had thought to look, which was the ordinary miracle of an animal that pays attention to the ground it walks on, which is the only ground there is. A neighbor's granddaughter, 6 years old, came with her grandfather to see the spring in April. She stood at the bank and watched the water come out of the rock and asked Clara how it got in there. Clara thought about the aquifer and the limestone and the rain and the fissures and all of it, and then she said that the ground holds what you put in it and gives it back when it's ready. The girl looked at the water, and then at the ground, and then at the water again. Then she asked if they could put something in and see. Clara said yes. They found a leaf, and the girl set it on the ground a few feet from the spring's emergence point, and they both watched to see what happened, which was nothing, because the ground doesn't give things back that quickly. But it was the right question, which was exactly what Clara told her, and it was the right age for asking it, which was any age at all.